Okay, today we're talking about the respiratory system. The respiratory system is the passageways that filter incoming air into the body and exported air out of the body. The reason that we do this is to exchange gases between the air that we breathe and our body's cells. So we'll be talking about the following events: ventilation, inhalation and exhalation, so internal respiration, transport of gases, and then ultimately cellular respiration. So a lot of this will be familiar to some things that maybe you talked about in general biology or maybe even biochemistry to talk about the actual process of the gas exchange. So the reason why we breathe is to exchange oxygen in the air, which is the molecule that we need for cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide, which is the waste of cellular respiration. So we get the carbon dioxide out and we are breathing in new oxygen. Aerobic respiration, the word aerobic means it requires oxygen. So we need this for ATP production. There are a few processes that our cells can use that do not require oxygen, which are called anaerobic. They produce much less ATP than the aerobic processes. And we get rid of the carbon dioxide generally by forming the bicarbonate ion using this carbonic anhydrase enzyme that we'll talk about. Again, the purpose of respiration is to breathe in oxygen and to breathe out carbon dioxide. So in this lecture, we are going to go over the broad processes and organs that are involved. You will spend a lot of time on this going through the lab, looking at all of these structures and processes in much more detail. So feel free to pause on any of these images that I'm going to be going through kind of quickly. Again, you will spend a lot of time navigating through all of these different structures in the lab on your own. So there's two major parts of the respiratory system. There's the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is usually the nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, and pharynx. And then the lower starts with L, larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs. So we're going to start with the upper respiratory tract and proceed on to the lower. Again, I'm going to move through a lot of these images pretty quickly. Feel free to pause to orient yourself or to reference this when you're answering your questions later. So starting with the nose, you have the frontal sinuses, you have the pharyngeal tonsils up here, which are usually referred to as adenoids, and then you have the structures of the mouth, the structures of the throat. The nasal cavity is the hollow space behind the nose between the hard palate and the cribriform plates. It's separated by the nasal septum. It is lined with a mucous membrane, which is called a pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. It's called pseudostratified because it still is just one layer of cells thick, even though it looks like it's stratified into more than one layer of cells. The purpose of the nasal cavity is to bring in air. Also, air is warmed, moistened, and filtered when it goes through the nasal cavity. So this is a picture of those pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. Even though they are just one layer thick, they're called pseudostratified. The sinuses are air-filled spaces between the maxillary, frontoid, ethmoid, and sphenoid bones in the skull. Mucous membranes line these, and they reduce the weight of the skull. They also serve for voice resonant chambers. So these are up here kind of behind the nasal cavity. And then the next structure that we'll need to talk about is called the pharynx. So the pharynx is posterior behind the oral cavity, between the nasal cavity and the larynx. So back here, it's separated into three main structures. The nose, oro, mouth, and laryngopharynx. So we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So all back here. The next structure that we'll talk about is the larynx. The larynx is the enlargement of the airway. It's superior to the trachea and inferior to the pharynx. So it's a framework of muscles and cartilage bound by elastic tissue. There's 3 single cartilages, the thyroid, cryoid, and epiglottic. This is part of the epiglottis. And then there's 3 types of paired cartilages that we'll find here. Again, you will navigate this all when you're looking through your lab to see each of these structures. So the larynx contains 2 horizontal folds of composed muscle and connective tissue. We have the first one is the false vocal cords, and then behind them is the true vocal cords, and then the opening between them is the glottis. So again, feel free to pause and use this as kind of a guide as you start navigating through these structures on your own. Next is the trachea. The trachea is often called the windpipe. It's flexible, cylindrical, it extends downward. It is anterior to the esophagus. You can feel the ridges of your trachea right here in the front of your throat, and the esophagus is behind the trachea. It splits into the left and right primary bronchi, and it is lined with ciliated mucous membranes. So ciliated has these little hair-like fibers, and these cilia are going to trap things that could later be expelled or coughed or removed to be caught in mucus to prevent. It's kind of your first line of defense with your innate immune system, is to kind of trap bacteria and things that you don't necessarily want in your body. So it has different functions to kind of move the air through, also to kind of trap things in that mucus that you don't want to inhale. And the wall has these C-shaped rings that we'll look at here. So here we see these C-shaped rings. You see the lumen here in the middle. This is the opening. This is a cross-section of the trachea with the connective tissue and muscle, the hyaline cartilage, and the ciliated epithelium. So in here, this would be where all the cilia is. Again, this is lined with the mucus and cells that are producing mucus to catch any kind of bacteria or stuff that we don't want to inhale. This is a look from the front. Here is the trachea. This would be showing a picture of a tracheotomy. This would be the incision into the trachea if somebody was ever to have a breathing tube put in. This is where it goes here in the trachea. You can see the thyroid gland up here. Thyroid cartilage, this jugular notch, kind of help orient where this would go. Also up here is the hyoid bone. This is the only bone in the skeletal system that doesn't articulate with any other bones. We're not going to talk about the hyoid bone in the respiratory system, but it is involved in speech and swallowing. Okay, so let's talk about the bronchial tree. So it's called a tree because it branches out. It looks very similar to the branching structure of a tree. And it consists of branched airways leading from the trachea to these microscopic air sacs in the lungs. Each primary bronchus leads from the trachea to enter the lung. So we go from the larynx to the trachea, and then from the trachea into these bronchial trees that are throughout our lungs. And ultimately getting to these alveolus cells, and the alveolus cells, these are where, this is the location of the gas exchange, the air that we're breathing, which contains oxygen, and then the air that we're exhaling. Oh no, that made me yawn. The air that we're exhaling, which is going to remove the carbon dioxide. Again, the reason that we need to do this is because the way that our cells make energy, which is called cellular respiration, those processes are aerobic, meaning they require oxygen. Oxygen is the fuel for these cellular processes. and the waste is carbon dioxide. So the reason that we need to breathe in air and breathe out carbon dioxide is because the air, the oxygen in the air is required for these cellular processes that we use to make energy, to make ATP, and carbon dioxide is the waste product. So we're breathing in oxygen, O2, in the air, and we're breathing out carbon dioxide. Okay, here's a good picture of the branches of the bronchial tree. Again, you all will spend a lot of time going through this in lab and identifying different structures on your own. So feel free to pause and use this as a reference as you're navigating that. This is a picture showing the interlobular bronchioles. You see how they are wrapped with this smooth muscle. And then down here at the end of these branches are these alveolar ducts and the alveolar sacs. The sac is filled with the air that we're breathing, and you can see it is surrounded by a pulmonary arteriole and a pulmonary venule, and then where they intersect in the middle is the capillary. So this is the capillary network on the surface of the alveolus. So what's happening here in the lungs is we're picking up the oxygen that we're breathing, and we are going to use that oxygen to transport it to all the different parts of our cells, all the different parts of our body, that the cells that are using the oxygen. Okay, so the structure of the respiratory tubes, we talked about this already. They branch off from the trachea down into the lungs. They become thinner and thinner, ultimately into the alveoli, and the alveolar wall is composed of a single squamous epithelium. This is important because we need the exchange of the gases to happen there in this single layer. And this is a better picture of this. So this would be the open sac here in the alveoli. So this is where the air is. What's happening here is oxygen is going in and carbon dioxide is going out. So this is gas exchange. So this is the site of gas exchange is in the alveoli, which are in the lungs. And carbon dioxide, both of these are going down their concentration gradient. So oxygen is going in and carbon dioxide is going out. This is just some different images of the blood vessels, capillaries, and alveoli, and then even more zoomed in on the structure of the alveolus. Oh, talking about breathing makes me yawn. Okay, so the next structure that we'll talk about are the lungs. So the lungs, there's two lungs, the right and left. They are spongy and soft. There will be some images of lungs for you to look at, looking at healthy lungs compared to diseased lungs. And it's separated by the heart and the mediastinum. And the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes. So from the trachea and the bronchiole down into the lungs, that's what we're looking at here. So this would be a plane. Here's showing the plane of section here, looking kind of cross section. We have the hilum, which is the region on the medial surface of each lungs through which the bronchus and the large blood vessels enter. Then we have the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. Remember, visceral means it's in contact with the organ, and then the parietal pleura is the serous membrane which lines the pleural cavity. So one is on the side of the organ, the lung, and one is on the other side of the cavity. This just summarizes the different parts of the respiratory system that we just went through. This again would be a great slide to help answer some of the questions about the parts of the respiratory system if you want to pause here. So let's talk about breathing. We've talked about all of the different parts. Now we're going to talk about how it works. So breathing or ventilation is the movement from the air outside the body into the body. Again, the reason we're doing this is because we need oxygen for cellular respiration for these processes that make energy. We need to get the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out. So These two processes are called inhalation, which is called inspiration, and exhalation, which is called expiration. So inspiration or inhaling, this is all, a lot of this is going to be regulated by the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. So atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 760 millimeters of mercury, mmHg. So this is a unit of pressure. Atmospheres is another unit of pressure. Sometimes you see torr or bar. All of these are units of pressure. We would have talked about this in chemistry. Also, something we talked about in chemistry is the relationship between pressure and volume and how they are inversely proportional. So if the pressure increases, the volume decreases, or if the volume increases, the pressure decreases. So what happens is when we breathe, and our lungs expand, it forces air into our lungs. You can kind of think about that like the plunger on a syringe here. If you have the plunger down here, if it goes up or down, whatever is happening to, so if you pull this plunger down and it increases the volume, it's going to decrease the pressure. So air is going to go in. So that's what's happening when we're breathing. When we breathe, we have a lower pressure inside our lungs than outside our lungs because of the change in volume, and air goes into our lungs. So this relationship is called Boyle's law. You don't need to know that for this class, but we would have talked about pressure and volume and their inverse relationship in chemistry. So intra-alveolar pressure decreases to about 758 millimeters of mercury as the thoracic cavity enlarges. So as we breathe, as it expands, and then this means that the air is just going to go in by itself because it always goes down its concentration gradient. And this is regulated by the phrenic nerve. We'll talk a lot about the nerves that are responsible for these processes in a minute. So what's happening here when we inhale is the diaphragm contracts. So that's a big muscle down here at the base of our lungs. When it contracts, it makes more space for the lungs. And the intercostal muscles between the ribs pull up and out. The sternum moves out. And the diaphragm, when we, sorry, I'm not tired. Talking about breathing makes me yawn. When this happens, it forces the air into our lungs. So here's the major events of inspiration when we breathe in. Now let's talk about expiration when we breathe out. So the forces responsible for expiration come from what's called elastic recoil of the lung tissue from the surface tension of the alveoli. So this helps maintain, or these factors increase the intra-alveolar pressure about 1 millimeter of mercury above atmospheric pressure, and that's going to force air out of the lungs. And then all of the reverse things happen to the muscles. The abdominal organs recoil, pushing the diaphragm upwards, and that kind of pushes the air back out of the lungs. And then again, here are the major events of expiration. Oh no. Okay, so the science and the measurement of the volume of air in our lungs is called spirometry, and this is showing kind of the volume of your lungs and just kind of regular breathing. This is how we measure lung function, residual volume, tidal volume, how much capacity there is in your lungs to breathe in or out. So this is the, here's the definition of each of these. So we have what's called anatomical dead space. So this is the air in the respiratory tract that fails to reach the alveoli. We have alveolar dead space, which is created if the alveoli in some regions don't function. And then we have what's called physiological dead space. This is the combination of anatomical and alveolar dead space. So this is how we measure kind of lung function, capacity of being able to move air in and out of your lungs. You can pause here and read through this about the different rates of ventilation. And then also we have what are called non-respiratory air movements. So we can move air, coughing, sneezing, expressing emotions, laughing, crying, yawning. All of this is moving air around, but in a non-respiratory way where we are not breathing to just move air for cellular respiration, but for some other purpose. So how do we control our breathing? So breathing is rhythmic and involuntary, so it even acts when a person is unconscious, but it can be controlled voluntarily. So your body will know when to breathe on its own by your involuntary nervous system, or you can choose to breathe voluntarily. Okay. Oh no. I'm not gonna be able to get through this. Okay, so there are groups of neurons in the brainstem that comprise the respiratory areas that control breathing. So these travel on the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and these cause inspiration and expiration. Also, there's the medullary respiratory center, ventral and dorsal respiratory center, and the pontine respiratory group. So this is kind of showing the nerves and the location of these different areas in the brain that are responsible for breathing. Again, basic respiratory changes in breath or rhythmic breathing here. Okay, so some factors that affect breathing are mainly the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Remember, oxygen is the fuel, carbon dioxide is the waste. And there are receptors, mechanoreceptors, and peripheral chemoreceptors that are going to help regulate and tell our nervous system when we need to breathe. Another thing that impacts breathing is the change in blood pH. So the process by which we get rid of the waste, removing the carbon dioxide, we'll see the chemical formula for this in a little bit. But the way that we do this is going to change the pH of our blood. And the pH of our blood is very tightly regulated. And when we have carbon dioxide in our blood, it's converted to the bicarbonate ion, which produces the hydrogen ion, which makes our blood a little tiny bit more acidic. And when our blood becomes a little more acidic, that also that tells our brain, our respiratory center, it's time to breathe because there's more carbon dioxide waste in our blood and we need to exhale it. So again, all of this is regulated by these nerves, and feel free to pause on any of these slides to orient yourself when you are going through this in the lab. Okay, so let's talk about alveolar gas exchange. So this is where we are swapping out the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we have the alveolar pores, and this is a picture here kind of showing this empty space where the air will go. So here's the alveolus. We have type 1 and type 2. Let's see here. Type 1, type 2, this is the surfactant secreting cells. So surfactant is a word that kind of means like soap. And it's secreting this substance here that allows these cells to move kind of almost like a bubble, how it can expand and contract. And this is what's happening here where the gases are. And you can see that these are just one cell thick, so that this provides a place for the gases to exchange through this capillary wall. So the respiratory membrane here showing what we just looked at, these type 2 cells that secrete this pulmonary surfactant. Again, this keeps the cell wall, the cell membranes kind of lubricated and stretchy so they can expand and contract. And then the gas exchange between the alveolar air, so that's the air that we breathe in through our lungs, and the blood occurs through the respiratory membrane. And then the components of that respiratory membrane that we saw, the alveolar wall, the blood capillary wall, and then the basement membrane. So we're exchanging the gases between these. And that's what we're looking at here. Here's the red blood cell, which would be transporting the oxygen. So we're going to pick up the oxygen from the alveoli. And then this red blood cell will circulate through our circulatory system and bring the oxygen to the cells that need it. So let's talk about how these molecules diffuse through the respiratory membrane. So molecules are going to diffuse from regions where they are higher in concentration to where they are lower in concentration. And the way that we normally say this is that they go down their concentration gradient, which just means they go from high to low. This is passive transport. This happens automatically. It does not require any sort of energy or any help. So it's just naturally going to go from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration gradient. It's going with the concentration gradient. So it's going to go from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. So what's happening here, if you look at the partial pressures, here the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 millimeters of mercury. Again, millimeters of mercury is just a unit. It's like Celsius or Fahrenheit or feet or inches. So don't be thrown off by the millimeters of mercury. It's just the pressure that it would cause for a barometer to show what the atmospheric pressure is. So don't be thrown off by this weird unit. But we're going from 45 millimeters of mercury to 40 millimeters of mercury. So this carbon dioxide is just going to freely diffuse from the blood into the alveolus. Here, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury, and here it's 104. So the partial pressure of oxygen is going to go from high to low. It's going to go from the lungs into the blood. So we have this alveolar wall where these molecules can freely diffuse from either the lungs, the alveolus, into the blood, or from the blood into the alveolus. And again, it's always going to go down its concentration gradient. So as the gases enter the blood, they dissolve in the plasma or chemically combine with atoms and molecules. So now this is back to chemistry a little bit, between things that will dissolve with each other and things that will not. So remember, blood is mostly made up of water. Water is polar. Both oxygen and carbon dioxide are non-polar molecules. Remember when we draw the Lewis structure and we look at the molecular geometry, we see what the vectors are. Is this molecule polar or non-polar? Water is polar, oxygen is non-polar, which means oxygen is not going to dissolve into water. So the thing that we have for that, we have a transport molecule that transports oxygen in our blood. That's the protein hemoglobin. So hemoglobin will pick up the oxygen and take the oxygen, because oxygen cannot just exist naturally in the blood because polar and nonpolar don't mix. We're going to see all of this in much more detail in a minute. Carbon dioxide is also nonpolar, but carbon dioxide does not have a transport molecule like oxygen does. Carbon dioxide goes through what's called a buffering system. This buffering system converts carbon dioxide, which is nonpolar, to the bicarbonate ion, which is a charged ion, which is soluble in water, blood. So we convert the carbon dioxide into this bicarbonate ion until we get back to the lungs, and then we can exhale it as carbon dioxide. So that's what we're going to explain in the next few slides. So this says almost all oxygen carried in the blood is bound to the protein hemoglobin. Why? Because oxygen is not soluble in blood, because oxygen is nonpolar, blood is polar. The rest is dissolved in the blood plasma. This is very, very, very little oxygen, less than 2% of the oxygen. This is not a way to transport oxygen. Oxygen needs to be bound to hemoglobin. Oxygen loosely binds to the iron in the heme unit. So we'll look at this a little bit in chemistry or biochemistry. We could spend forever talking about hemoglobin and the protein structure and all of this. But basically, you have a heme in the middle, and the heme has a binding site for oxygen. In that binding site, there's an iron, and that's how the oxygen binds. So it's kind of like a little Uber for the oxygen. It picks it up, takes it where it needs to go, and it releases it. And it remains bound to the hemoglobin until it gets to a cell that needs it. Oxygen has a sigmoidal, it's called cooperative binding to hemoglobin, which means oxygen will bind hemoglobin when the partial pressure of oxygen is high, and then it will release when the partial pressure is low. So that's what we want. We want oxygen to be picked up by the hemoglobin in the lungs, and then we want oxygen to be dropped off to the tissue when the partial pressure of oxygen is low. So it picks it up and takes it where it needs to go. When the hemoglobin picks up an oxygen, now we call it oxyhemoglobin. This hemoglobin without the oxygen we would call deoxyhemoglobin. Basically what this picture and the next few slides are trying to show you is that oxygen gets picked up by the hemoglobin carries it where it needs to go, and then it releases it. And then the oxygen can go into the cell where then it is needed for aerobic respiration, like the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, cellular processes that we use to make ATP. This is a series of other graphs looking at partial pressure, pH, and temperature. All of these slides are just to show that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen changes under different situations. This is what we want. We want hemoglobin to want to pick up the oxygen in the lungs. We also want the hemoglobin to drop the oxygen off in the tissues. This is something we talk about a lot in biochemistry. It's not something that you really need to understand in a lot of detail here, but this is important that hemoglobin has a different affinity for oxygen in different situations, because if hemoglobin wanted to pick up the oxygen in the lungs, but then it never wanted to let it go, that would be bad, because the purpose of hemoglobin is to bind oxygen, but then also to release it when it needs to. If it just bound it and then it never let it go, the tissues and the cells that need the oxygen would never have access to it because the hemoglobin would just hold on to it. What these graphs are showing is that the hemoglobin is going to pick up the oxygen in the lungs, and then when it gets to the tissue, it's going to let the oxygen go. And then the hemoglobin will go back to the lungs, pick up more oxygen, and then take it to the tissue and let it go. So this is a transport protein so that we can get oxygen out of the air that we breathe and to the cells that need oxygen. Carbon dioxide has a different plan. So there is no molecule that transports carbon dioxide. And again, the reason that we need a molecule or some other plan is because carbon dioxide is non-polar. Water is polar. You know this because if you've ever gotten a soda and you go to open it and it's carbonated, that's carbon dioxide. Those carbon dioxide molecules, as soon as you open it, start coming out. That's what the bubbles are. It's not freely, it's not soluble in there. It's going to get out. If you open a soda and leave it for a day, you come back, there would be no carbon dioxide in there because it's all escaped. Blood is the same thing, but our blood is not carbonated like soda. So what happens when we take the oxygen and we use it in cellular respiration? Now we've produced carbon dioxide as waste. So we can't just have plain old carbon dioxide in our blood. We have to have some way to get it from our tissue that just used it through our bloodstream to our lungs and then exhale it as carbon dioxide. The way that we do that is through what's called the carbonic acid buffering system, where there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that converts carbon dioxide to what's called the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion. Now, both of these are charged, and if you remember from chemistry, charged ions are soluble in polar substances. So now this hydrogen ion and this bicarbonate ion can circulate freely in our blood. So let's say we have a cell in our arm somewhere that used oxygen. So we picked up the oxygen in our lungs, the hemoglobin in our blood picked up the oxygen in our lung and took the oxygen to a muscle fiber in our bicep. The muscle fiber in our bicep used the oxygen to go through the electron transport chain and make some ATP. In the process of doing that, it made carbon dioxide as waste. So now we have carbon dioxide that we need to exhale, but we need to get the carbon dioxide from the muscle fiber in our bicep back to our lungs so that we can exhale it. So what happens is the carbon dioxide goes through this buffering system. It converts the carbon dioxide into the bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. Now this bicarbonate ion goes in our bloodstream from our bicep all the way back to our lungs. When it gets to our lungs, you see how both of these arrows are reversible. The same enzyme that converted the carbon dioxide to hydrogen and the bicarbonate ion, that same enzyme can convert the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion back to carbon dioxide. This happens in the lungs. If you're in the tissue, the arrows go this way, from carbon dioxide to bicarbonate. If you're in the lungs, the arrow goes this way, from the bicarbonate ion back to carbon dioxide. So when we get back to the lungs, we convert the bicarbonate ion is H3O minus. We convert that back to carbon dioxide, and then we exhale it as carbon dioxide. So that's how it works. And again, the reason we need this is because oxygen and carbon dioxide are both non-polar, so they cannot just freely diffuse in our blood. So that's what these next few slides are going to represent. That's what these pictures are going to show. So this is showing the movement of the carbon dioxide from the tissue cells. So this would be like my bicep muscle example, and how the carbon dioxide goes out and it is going to be converted to the bicarbonate ion, and then it's going to go through our blood back to our lungs where we can exhale it. Another thing to say is that the bicarbonate ion, while it is soluble, transporting it in and out of tissues is easier when you have another ion to go along with it. This is showing how we have this chloride ion that will go with the bicarbonate ion. So this is called the chloride shift. And then this is what's happening during exhalation. So once we get back to the lungs, the bicarbonate ion is going to be converted back into carbon dioxide, and then the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolus and then exhaled as carbon dioxide. So we said most of oxygen, 98%, is going to be combined with hemoglobin to be transported through our body. Carbon dioxide, most of it does what I just explained, 70%, is going to be converted to the bicarbonate ion via this carbonic anhydrase enzyme. There also are other options. A little bit of carbon dioxide can diffuse in the blood plasma, and about 23% can be converted into what's called carbamino hemoglobin. This is where the hemoglobin can transport some of the carbon dioxide. But for the most part, carbon dioxide is converted to the bicarbonate ion via that carbonic acid buffering system. Okay, that's basically it for the respiratory system. This shows some of the changes with lifespan. Sometimes the cilia becomes less active, the mucus can thicken, swallowing, gagging, coughing reflexes can slow. There can be changes in dead space volume, and also bronchial walls can thin and collapse. Again, you will spend a lot of time going through all of these structures in the lab. Please feel free to pause on some of the recaps and the anatomical breakdowns as you navigate that on your own.